And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Starting up north with tomorrow morning's flying weather graphic, IFR here, the Brooks Range on out across the north slope to the eastern Arctic coast. Marginal VFR here down the western interior, leading into some more IFR as we move into the southwest coast here, on into portions of Bristol Bay, the Alaska Peninsula area. And IFR, Western Alaska Range, also over the Talkeetnas, North Gulf Coast, over to about Elfin Cove. Mostly marginal now for the Panhandle, and a lot of marginal VFR out over the western Bering Sea. And then we'll see for the afternoon, next system out here pushing some IFR over to about Amchitka Island westward. Otherwise, no change over the Bering Sea and the Aleutians. Marginal VFR, Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, portions of the Seward Peninsula into Kotzebue Sound, and a diminishing IFR area there for the North Slope, Central Brooks Range out toward the Arctic coast. Increasing VFR over the interior here, even into northern Cook Inlet, and the Western Alaska Range becoming VFR, most of the Copper River Basin, and a little bit of IFR around Yakutat, the northern Panhandle, and over toward the eastern border. Otherwise, the Gulf of Alaska, marginal VFR. And then for Monday morning, IFR holding here along the Brooks Range to the eastern Arctic coast, and some scattered marginal VFR mainly over the upper Yukon Valley areas in the interior. Some IFR up to the Central Alaska Range, extending down across the Talkeetna Mountains to the Prince William Sound area here, and maybe the Chugach Mountains, possibly, more likely marginal VFR there, and Cook Inlet VFR down to Fognak Island. IFR here for the Aleutian Range, marginal VFR, Bering Sea Aleutians, and the building IFR out here to the west. And for the afternoon, that retreats back to the southwest, leaving the entire Aleutian chain in the marginal VFR zone, northward to the Bering Strait. A little bit IFR lingering there along the Brooks Range, marginal VFR on out to the Arctic coast. Pretty good VFR here through the central interior. Scattered marginal VFR across southern Alaska, mostly VFR for the afternoon for Kodiak Island, and VFR making a comeback there for the southeast coast. Passes tomorrow, Sunday, Anatuvik and Adigan, another IFR day for both those passes. Lake Clark and Merrill, marginal VFR. Early on, improving the VFR for the remainder of the day. Same pattern for rainy, windy, VFR. Isabel, VFR, but Mentesta, marginal VFR at times throughout the day Sunday. And Tanita, marginal VFR, improving the VFR. And for Portage, IFR to start with marginal VFR from the late morning through the afternoon. And Chilkoot and White, ending your VFR streak there, looking at some IFR for Sunday through both passes. And for the freezing levels, 2,000 to 4,000 feet here in the central interior, extending down in toward Bethel, and about 4,000 to 6,000 feet over the southeast coast. And looking at the icing, next system pushing some icing, moderate rime icing into Chimay-Attu, and also up here to the north of the moisture up there, we've got some heavier icing up along the eastern Arctic coast, possibly to just north of Fort Yukon, and some areas of lighter isolated moderate rime icing possible over the western interior, across southern Alaska, Yakutat, a little bit heavier icing in the forecast there, considerable moderate, and areas of icing also for the southeast coast. Jet stream, 33,000 feet, southerly winds 65 knots over the eastern interior from the Yukon here and the northeastern North Gulf Coast right up into the eastern Arctic coast. Stronger jet just grazing the east central Aleutians here, but the main core of the jet south of even there. And for 9,000 feet, northeast winds 35 knots there for the western Arctic coast. Northwest 35 to 40 knots for the central eastern Aleutians into the Alaska Peninsula. Light over the interior, and some easterlies at about 35 knots here, as high as 40 knots for the north coast of the Panhandle, 35 knots here for the North Gulf Coast, and at 3,000 feet, pretty light winds here across southern Alaska, all the way up to the eastern Arctic coast, including the Panhandle and in the Gulf. But northeast winds 30 knots for the western North Slope Arctic coast, increasing to about 50 knots out of the north-northeast there through the Bering Strait. And then 30 to 35 knot northerly winds turning northwest here across the Alaska Peninsula. And for turbulence with the stronger winds, look for considerable moderate turbulence there, St. Lawrence Island through the Bering Strait, western Seward Peninsula up into the western Brooks Range area, and also here for the Alaska Peninsula to about Unalaska Island. Pretty smooth though for the Gulf of Alaska and the southern interior down across the Panhandle.